Chapter 8. The Laying of the Colossus. Back and forth, in an irregular, drunken, zigzag course, from end to end and side to side of the harried realm, the giant strode without pause, like an energumen possessed by some implacable fiend of mischief and murder, leaving behind him, as a reaper leaves his swath, an ever-lengthening zone of havoc, of rapine and carnage. And when the sun, blackened by the smoke of burning villages, had set luridly beyond the forest, men still saw him moving in the dusk, and heard still the portentous rumbling of his mad, stormy cachinnation. Nearing the gates of Ylourgne at sunset, Gaspard du Nord saw behind him, through gaps in the ancient wood, the far-off head and shoulders of the terrible Colossus, who moved along the Iswile, stooping from sight at intervals in some horrid deed. Though numb with weariness and exhaustion, Gaspard quickened his flight. He did not believe, however, that the monster would try to invade Ylourgne, the especial object of Nataire's hatred and malice, before the following day. The evil soul of the sorceress Dorf, exulting in its almost infinite capacity for harm and destruction, would defer the crowning act of vengeance, and would continue to terrorize, during the night, the outlying villages and rural districts. In spite of his rags and filth, which rendered him practically unrecognizable and gave him a most disreputable air, Gaspard was admitted without question by the guards at the city gate. Ylourgne was already thronged with people who had fled to the sanctuary of its stout walls from the adjacent countryside, and no one, not even the most dubious character, was denied admittance. The walls were lined with archers and pike-bearers, gathered in readiness to dispute the entrance of the giant. Crossbowmen were stationed above the gates, and mangonels were mounted at short intervals along the entire circuit of the ramparts. The city seethed and hummed like an agitated hive. Hysteria and pandemonium prevailed in the streets. Pale, panic-stricken faces milled everywhere in an aimless stream. Hurrying torches flared dolorously in the twilight that deepened as if with the shadow of impending wings arisen from Erebus. The gloom was clogged with intangible fear, with webs of stifling oppression. Through all this rout of wild disorder and frenzy, Gaspard, like a spent but indomitable swimmer breasting some tide of eternal viscid nightmare, made his way slowly to his attic lodgings. Afterwards, he could scarcely remember eating and drinking. Overworn beyond the limit of bodily and spiritual endurance, he threw himself down on his pallet without removing his ooze-stiffened tatters, and slept soddenly till an hour halfway between midnight and dawn. He awoke with the death-pale beams of the gibbous moon shining upon him through his window, and rising, spent the balance of the night in making certain occult preparations which, he felt, offered the only possibility of coping with the fiendish monster that had been created and animated by Nataire. Working feverishly by the light of the westering moon and a single dim taper, Gaspard assembled various ingredients of familiar alchemic use which he possessed, and compounded from these, through a long and somewhat cabalistic process, a dark grey powder which he had seen employed by Nataire on numerous occasions. He had reasoned that the Colossus, being formed from the bones and flesh of dead men unlawfully raised up, and energized only by the soul of a dead sorcerer, would be subject to the influence of this powder, which Nataire had used for the laying of resurrected liches. The powder, if cast in the nostrils of such cadavers, would cause them to return peacefully to their tombs and lie down in a renewed slumber of death. Gaspard made a considerable quantity of the mixture, arguing that no mere finger-pinch would suffice for the lulling of the gigantic charnel monstrosity. His guttering yellow candle was dimmed by the white dawn as he ended the Latin formula of fearsome verbal invocation from which the compound would derive much of its efficacy. The formula, which called for the cooperation of Alastor and other evil spirits, he used with unwillingness. But he knew there was no alternative. Sorcery could be fought only with sorcery. Morning came with new terrors to Ylourgne. Gaspard had felt, through a sort of intuition, that the vengeful Colossus, who was said to have wandered with unhuman tirelessness and diabolic energy all night through Aveyron, would approach the hated city early in the day. His intuition was confirmed, for scarcely had he finished his occult labors when he heard a mounting hubbub in the streets, and above the shrill, dismal clamor of frightened voices, the far-off roaring of the giant. Gaspard knew that he must lose no time if he were to post himself in a place of vantage from which he could throw his powder into the nostrils of the 100-foot Colossus. The city walls, and even most of the church spires, were not lofty enough for this purpose, and a brief reflection told him that the great cathedral, standing at the core of Ylourgne, was the one place from whose roof he could front the invader with success. He felt sure that the men-at-arms on the walls could do little to prevent the monster from entering and wreaking his malevolent will. No earthly weapon could injure a being of such bulk and nature, for even a cadaver of normal size, reared up in this fashion, could be shot full of arrows or transfixed by a dozen pikes without retarding its progress. Hastily, he filled a huge leathern pouch with the powder, and carrying the pouch at his belt, he joined the agitated press of people in the street. Many were fleeing toward the cathedral to seek the shelter of its august sanctity, and he had only to let himself be borne along by the frenzy-driven stream. The cathedral nave was packed with worshippers, and solemn masses were being said by priests whose voice faltered at times with inward panic. Unheeded by the wan, despairing throng, Gaspard found a flight of coiling stairs that led tortuously to the gargoyle-warded roof of the high tower. Here he posted himself, crouching behind the stone figure of a cat-headed griffin. From his vantage he could see, beyond the crowded spires and gables, the approaching giant, whose head and torso loomed above the city walls. A cloud of arrows, visible even at that distance, rose to meet the monster, who apparently did not even pause to pluck them from his hide. Great boulders hurled from mangonels were no more to him than the pelting of gravel. The heavy bolts of arbalists, embedded in his flesh, were mere slivers. Nothing could stay his advance. The tiny figures of a company of pikemen, who opposed him with out-thrust weapons, were swept from the walls above the eastern gate by a single sidelong blow of the 70-foot pine that he bore for a cudgel. Then, having cleared the wall, the Colossus climbed over it into Ylourgne. Roaring, chuckling, laughing like a maniacal cyclops, he strode along the narrow streets between houses that rose only to his waist, trampling without mercy everyone who could not escape in time, and smashing in the roofs with stupendous blows of his bludgeon. With a push of his left hand, he broke off the protruding gables, and overturned the church steeples with their bells clanging in dolorous alarm as they went down. A woeful shrieking and wail of hysteria-laden voices accompanied his passing. Straight toward the cathedral he came, as Gaspard had calculated, feeling that the high edifice would be made the special butt of his malevolence. The streets were now emptied of people, but, as if to hunt them out and crush them in their hiding places, the giant thrust his cudgel like a battering ram through walls and windows and roofs as he went by. The ruin and havoc that he left were indescribable. Soon he loomed opposite the cathedral tower on which Gaspard waited behind the gargoyle. His head was level with the tower, and his eyes flamed like wells of burning brimstone as he drew near. His lips were parted over stalactic fangs in a hateful snarl, and he cried out in a voice like the rumbling of articulate thunder. "Ho, ye puling priests and devotees of a powerless god! Come forth and bow to Nater the Master, before he sweeps you into limbo!" It was then that Gaspard, with a hardihood beyond comparison, rose from his hiding place and stood in full view of the raging Colossus. "Draw nearer, Notaire, if indeed it be you, foul robber of tombs and charnels," he taunted. "Come close, for I would hold speech with you." A monstrous look of astonishment dimmed the diabolic rage on the colossal features. Peering at Gaspard, as if in doubt or incredulity, the giant lowered his lifted cudgel and stepped close to the tower, till his face was only a few feet from the intrepid student. Then, when he had apparently convinced himself of Gaspard's identity, the look of maniacal wrath returned, flooding his eyes with Tartarian fire and twisting his lineaments into a mask of Apollyon-like malignity. His left arm came up in a prodigious arc, with twitching fingers that poised horribly above the head of the youth, casting upon him a vulture-black shadow in the full-risen sun. Gaspard saw the white, startled faces of the necromancer's pupils peering over his shoulder from their plank-built basket. "Is it you, Gaspard, my recreant pupil?" the colossal roared stormily. "I thought you were rotting in the oubliette beneath Ylourgne, and now I find you perched atop this accursed cathedral, which I am about to demolish. You had been far wiser to remain where I left you, my good Gaspard." His breath, as he spoke, blew like a charnel-polluted gale on the student. His vast fingers, with blackened nails like shovel blades, hovered in ogreish menace. Gaspard had furtively loosened his leathern pouch that hung at his belt and untied its mouth. Now, as the twitching fingers descended toward him, he emptied the contents of the pouch in the giant's face, and the fine powder, mounting in a dark gray cloud, obscured the snarling lips and palpitating nostrils from his view. Anxiously, he watched the effect, fearing that the powder might be useless after all against the superior arts and satanical resources of Notaire. But, miraculously, as it seemed, the evil lambence died in the pit-deep eyes as the monster inhaled the flying cloud. His lifted hand, narrowly missing the crouching youth in its sweep, fell lifelessly at his side. The anger was erased from the mighty, contorted mask, as if from the face of a dead man. The great cudgel fell with a crash to the empty street, and then, with drowsy, lurching steps and listless, hanging arms, the giant turned his back to the cathedral and retraced his way through the devastated city. He muttered dreamily to himself as he went, and people who heard him swore that the voice was no longer the awful, thunder-swollen voice of Notaire, but the tones and accents of a multitude of men, amid which the voices of certain of the ravished dead were recognizable. And the voice of Notaire himself, no louder now than in life, was heard at intervals through the manifold mutterings, as if protesting angrily. Climbing the eastern wall as it had come, the Colossus went to and fro for many hours, no longer wreaking a hellish wrath and rancor, but searching, as people thought, for the various tombs and graves from which the hundreds of bodies that composed it had been so foully reft. From charnel to charnel, from cemetery to cemetery it went, through all the land, but there was no grave anywhere in which the dead Colossus could lie down. Then, toward evening, men saw it from afar on the red rim of the sky, digging with its hands in the soft, loamy plain beside the river Iswile. There, in the monstrous and self-made grave, the Colossus laid itself down and did not rise again. The 10 pupils of Notaire, it was believed, unable to descend from their basket, were crushed beneath the mighty body, for none of them was ever seen thereafter. For many days no one dared to approach the place where the corpse lay uncovered in its self-dug grave. And so the thing rotted prodigiously beneath the summer sun, breeding a mighty stench that wrought pestilence in that portion of Aveyron. And they who ventured to go near in the following autumn, when the stench had lessened greatly, swore that the voice of Notaire, still protesting angrily, was heard by them to issue from the enormous rook-haunted bulk. Of Gaspard du Nord, who had been the saviour of the province, it was related that he lived in much honour to a ripe age, being the one sorcerer of that region who at no time incurred the disapprobation of the Church.